Edward Sterling's mansion was a mausoleum of luxury, as silent as a hospital after visiting hours. Every immaculate room, decorated with a millionaire's coldness, exuded an absence of life. At the center of this silence was Leo, his 9-year-old son, a prisoner in a wheelchair and in his own mind. 2 years ago, a brutal car accident had taken his mother and left him paralyzed from the neck down, stealing his voice as well. Edward, a man who knew how to build empires, but not how to deal with his own pain, plunged himself into work. He outsourced his grief, handing his son over to an army of doctors and therapists, believing that money could fix a broken soul. Into this setting of protocols and efficiency, where affection was technical and smiles were scheduled, arrived Olivia Hayes. Hired just over a month ago, the new caregiver was an anomaly. Young, from the countryside, without the international diplomas of her predecessors, she brought with her a tool that no one else in that house seemed to possess, the simplicity of human presence. She didn't see Leo as a diagnosis or a professional challenge, but as a little boy. She spoke to him about the sky, read stories aloud to the silence, played soft music. Edward, watching from a distance on the cameras, considered her methods unscientific, a waste of time, but for some reason he couldn't comprehend. He let her stay. Edward's routine was a fortress against feeling. Wake before the sun, meetings, multi-million-dollar decisions. On that day, however, a cancelled meeting sent him home early, a twist of fate that would change everything. As he entered the silent mansion, a subtle sound drew him to the sunroom. It was music, and along with it, something he thought he would never hear again, a laugh. Hidden, he looked through the glass and the scene paralyzed him. Olivia was dancing gently with Leo's wheelchair, spinning them in a light, happy rhythm. And the boy, his silent, lost son, was holding his head up, his eyes shining, his mouth open in a pure, loud and vibrant laugh. A sound he hadn't heard in 2 years, a miracle that no amount of money could buy. What does this young caregiver know that the world's best specialists overlooked? If you believe in the power of human connection, subscribe to the channel and like this video to find out how the silence is about to be broken. Edward's routine was an armor against memory. Waking before the sun, black coffee, meetings. Every item on his schedule was a brick in the wall he had built around his heart. 2 years ago, he was the one driving. The memory of that night was a predator he kept caged. The sound of twisting metal, the face of his wife, Mariana, trying to shield their son with her own body, and the deafening silence of the heart monitor in the hospital. Faced with such vast pain, Edward didn't allow himself to cry. He declared war. He treated grief as a business problem, his son's paralysis as a project to be managed, believing that with enough resources, he could force life back to normal. In the months that followed, he poured his fortune into a desperate search for a cure. He transformed a wing of the mansion into a private medical center, bringing in neuroscientists from Germany and therapists from Sweden. He bought robotic physiotherapy equipment, funded experimental therapies, and subjected Leo to everything modern science could offer. But every attempt resulted in the same silence, the same empty gaze. Edward's initial hope soured, turning into a cold corporate impatience. He began to treat the doctors like incompetent employees, firing nurses who didn't produce results. He demanded progress metrics for a broken soul, trying to control with spreadsheets and reports a pain that could not be quantified. And with every failure, the wall around him grew higher. It was into this desert of technology and protocols that Olivia arrived, an anomaly of simplicity. She didn't bring new machines or degrees from foreign universities. Her only tool was her presence. Edward, watching on the cameras, saw her spend hours reading to the boy, playing soft music on her phone, or simply holding his hand in silence. She didn't follow a schedule of stimuli. She offered companionship. She talked to Leo as if he understood her perfectly, telling him about her own childhood, about the smell of rain on soil, about simple living things. Edward, at first, saw this as inefficient, but now the image of his son laughing forced him to confront a terrible truth. Maybe what Leo needed wasn't the best in the world, but simply a father. The image of his son's laughter haunted Edward for the rest of the day. That sound, which should have been the purest joy, became for him an echo of his own failure. He tried to take refuge in his work, in his spreadsheets and conference calls, but Leo's laugh seeped through the cracks of his armor of indifference. Every number he saw on the screen seemed to mock him. Every contract he signed felt insignificant. That simple miracle, brought about by a caregiver and a children's song, was a powerful indictment of the millions he had spent on cutting-edge treatments. Worse than the guilt, however, was the emotion he feared most: hope. And hope was dangerous, for he had felt it before, only to be crushed by disappointment. Driven by a need for control, Edward began a quiet investigation into Olivia. He needed a logical explanation, data, something to quantify what was happening. He asked the head housekeeper for detailed reports, reviewed hours of security footage, looking for a flaw, a mistake, anything to demystify what he had seen. But he found nothing. Only the image of a young woman treating his son with a patience and a care that were both professional and deeply human. He watched her massage Leo's hands, comb his hair, narrate the day outside. He, a man of facts, was faced with something he could not measure: the power of simple human connection. The conflict within him intensified when days later he witnessed another small miracle through the cameras. Olivia brought an old-fashioned music box into Leo's room. As she wound the key, a sweet, metallic melody filled the silence. Leo, who rarely moved his head, slowly turned it toward the sound, his eyes fixed on the small, spinning ballerina. And then Edward heard it, amplified by the camera's microphone, a sound from his son. It wasn't a word, but a sigh, a voluntary breath, the first vocalization Leo had made in 2 years. The laughter could have been a reflex, but that sound was a response. Proof that his son was still in there, somewhere, inside that silent body. That sigh was the final hammer blow against the wall Edward had built around himself. The evidence was undeniable. Olivia was reaching his son in a way no one else had. And this truth forced him to face his own emotional paralysis. He felt immense gratitude for her, but that gratitude was mixed with an overwhelming guilt for his own absence. That night, he wandered through the empty mansion, the silence that was once his refuge, now accusing him. He remembered how Mariana, his late wife, used to fill the house with music and laughter. In his attempt to banish the pain, he had also banished all life, turning his home into a luxury prison and himself into its main prisoner. When Olivia arrived at that mansion a month earlier, she felt as if she were entering a museum, not a home. The house didn't breathe. It was anesthetized by a silent, protocol-driven grief. The housekeeper greeted her with a list of schedules and procedures, and the smell of disinfectant seemed to have replaced the scent of life. Upon meeting Leo, she didn't see the diagnosis in a state-of-the-art wheelchair. She saw a 9-year-old boy. In his eyes, behind the apparent emptiness, she sensed the presence of a soul that had hidden itself, not disappeared. And she knew, in that instant, that her approach would not be that of a nurse, but of an ambassador from the outside world, sent to remind that little prince that he was not alone in his exile. She began to speak the only language Leo's silence seemed to understand, that of constant presence without expectation. She read children's stories, not to get a reaction, but to fill the room with the warmth of a human voice. She played soft music, not as therapy, but as companionship. And patiently, she began to collect what she called crumbs of reaction, little treasures that, Only her attentive eyes could see the way his pupils dilated slightly when she entered the room, a slightly faster blink when she told a silly joke, the almost imperceptible turn of his head toward the melody of the music box. These were minimal signs, invisible to Edward's cameras, but to Olivia they were letters sent from a very distant place. Olivia felt the weight of the environment, Edward's scrutinizing gaze from a distance, and the polite distrust of the other staff who had already seen many hopeful caregivers leave with broken hearts. But she was not shaken, for she had no expectations of a miracle. Her goal was simpler and at the same time more profound: to offer Leo a safe space to exist without the pressure of improvement, without the demand for results. She believed that the cure would not come from the outside, from a technique or a medicine, but from within the boy himself. Her job was not to rescue him, but to sit patiently outside the door he had closed, silently saying, "I'm here. When you're ready, you can come out." That laugh changed everything. Edward spent the rest of the day haunted by the image of his son, a mixture of guilt and a hope that terrified him. He, the man who solved multi-million-dollar problems, was powerless before the simplest and most important question of his life. That afternoon, he sought out Olivia, not as a boss, but as a desperate man in search of a map. In a difficult conversation on the veranda, he confessed what paralyzed him: his guilt. "I was driving that night, Olivia," he said, his voice breaking for the first time in 2 years. "I gave him everything money can buy, but I failed to give him the one thing he needed: me." Olivia listened with a silent empathy, offering no forgiveness or easy solutions. Her answer was simple, but deep as an ocean. "He doesn't need a specialist, Mr. Sterling. He needs his father." She encouraged him to do what he feared most, to just be present. Stay by his side even if you're afraid. Sit in the silence. He will feel that you are there. And then she gave him a bridge, a tool to cross the chasm that separated them. She handed him the tablet. "This is the music he heard in the garden. Tonight, try playing it for him. I think he'll like hearing it with you." The gesture was more than a suggestion. It was a key. That night, the mansion was quieter than ever. Edward stood in front of Leo's bedroom door, his heart pounding, the tablet in his hands, feeling as if it weighed a ton. This was the hardest step of his life. He entered, sat beside the wheelchair, and with trembling hands pressed play. The sweet, childish melody filled the room. He began to speak, the words coming out raw and full of pain. He spoke of Leo's mother, of how much he missed her, of his own fear and his absence. "I was so wrong, son. Forgive me for staying so far away." He took the boy's limp hand, expecting nothing in return, only offering for the first time his vulnerability. As the music played and silent tears streamed down Edward's face, he felt it, an almost imperceptible movement, a weak but unmistakable pressure. He looked down and saw it. Leo's fingers, which had been motionless for 2 years, were contracting slightly, squeezing his hand. It wasn't a spasm, it was a response, it was communication, it was connection. Edward held his breath, his heart stopping for an instant before racing with an overwhelming force. In that minimal touch, in that silent response, he didn't just feel his son's hand. He felt forgiveness, hope, and the certainty that finally, after a long, dark journey, he was finding his way back home. A small gesture, a universe of meaning. The door to Leo's heart has finally opened. If you've ever felt the power of a moment of pure connection, share your story in the comments and subscribe to the channel, because the silence is about to be broken for good. That subtle touch on his son's hand became Edward's new compass. His routine, once a wall of commitments to hide from the pain, was demolished. Business meetings were replaced by quiet hours at Leo's bedside. Financial spreadsheets gave way to children's storybooks. He was no longer managing a problem. He was nurturing a fragile, precious connection. Every night he repeated the ritual. He sat beside his son, held his hand, and played the soft melody Olivia had chosen. He didn't ask for more, didn't expect anything. He was just there, learning the difficult and beautiful language of presence, finally being the father his son needed, and not the CEO the world demanded. On one of those evenings, feeling stronger, Edward dared to speak about Mariana. He described her smile, the way she loved to dance with Leo in the living room, the way she called him "my little prince." He was no longer running from the memories. He was inviting them in, warming the cold room with the remembrance of the love that once united them. And as he spoke, he saw something in Leo that took his breath away. A single silent tear slid from the corner of the boy's eye. It wasn't a spasm, it was feeling. It was proof that his son was there, listening, feeling, connected to him through the shared sense of loss. Leo's tear was the key that unlocked the last bolted door in Edward's heart. With his voice choked by the emotion he finally allowed himself to feel, Edward confessed his deepest guilt. "Forgive me, son. Forgive me for pushing you away, for being so afraid. Dad was lost." He squeezed Leo's hand, and as the soft music filled the room, he saw the boy's lips part. A sound emerged, weak, hoarse, like a rusted gear beginning to move after years of disuse. And then the word, the first in 2 years, a word that was both a sound and a miracle: Dad. Time stopped. The world shrunk to that single sound, which traveled through the silence and struck Edward's heart with the force of a divine revelation. Edward froze, the impact of that word breaking him into 1,000 pieces and rebuilding him all at the same time. He looked at Leo, who was looking back at him, his eyes clear, present, alive. "Dad," the boy repeated, his voice a little steadier. The dam of Edward's emotions finally broke, and he collapsed into a sob of relief, a cry that washed away 2 years of pain and guilt. "I'm here, son. Dad is here." Later, upon leaving the room, he found Olivia in the hallway, standing as if she knew. "He spoke," Edward whispered, his voice still trembling. Olivia smiled, a smile that held all the wisdom and patience in the world. "I knew he was just waiting for you." And in that moment, Edward hugged her, a gesture of pure gratitude for the woman who taught him how to find his way back. The next morning in the Sterling mansion was born different. The oppressive silence that had reigned for 2 years had dissipated, replaced by a fragile, reverent atmosphere of hope. The staff, accustomed to moving like ghosts in an environment of mourning, now exchanged discreet glances and smiles. The news of Leo's miracle had spread through the corridors like a warm breeze. Edward came down for coffee, but instead of heading straight for his car, he stopped in the kitchen. He thanked the cook, said good morning to the housekeeper. His CEO armor had fallen away, revealing a vulnerable man, his eyes still swollen from crying, but with a lightness no one had ever seen in him. The transformation in him was as profound as his son's. The path back to Leo's heart was a delicate journey, and Edward began it with a newfound humility. He cancelled his international trips and cleared his schedule. Meetings in London and Dubai were replaced by physical therapy sessions on the living room floor. He was no longer the manager of his son's treatment, but an active participant. He learned to read Leo's signals, to celebrate the small victories, a new sound, a more focused gaze, a slightly stronger handshake. He was relearning how to be a father, discovering a deep and genuine joy in the simple moments that for so long his billion-dollar empire had prevented him from seeing. Olivia's role in the house also transformed. She went from being just the caregiver to being the emotional pillar of this new family dynamic. Edward treated her as a partner, a counselor whose wisdom came not from diplomas, but from a profound human intelligence. In a gesture of immense gratitude, he invited her to lead a new foundation he would create, dedicated to promoting a more holistic and humanized approach to care for children in trauma. Olivia's philosophy, based on simple presence and affection, which he had once considered unscientific, had become the cornerstone of his new life's purpose, a way to bring the healing they found to other families. Life, slowly, began to fill the empty rooms of the mansion again. Following Olivia's lead, Edward started playing Mariana's favorite songs again, and the soft melodies replaced the funereal silence. The smell of cleaning products gradually gave way to the smell of cookies baking in the oven, a simple activity that Edward, Olivia, and Leo began to do together on weekends. And laughter, the sound that was once a shocking miracle, became a constant presence in the hallways. Leo's body was still bound to the chair, but his spirit, so long captive in a prison of silence and pain, was finally free. The house, once a tomb of memories, was becoming a home again. A crucial part of Edward's healing was finally confronting the past. On a sunny afternoon, he took Leo and Olivia to the site of the accident. There, facing the landscape that haunted his nightmares, he verbalized his pain and his regret. "My mistake wasn't the accident, son. My mistake was shutting you out after it happened." The confession was the last ghost to be exorcised. Leo, hearing his father's words, reached out his hand and, in an increasingly clear voice, said 3 words that sealed their reconciliation. "I love you, Dad." It was the absolution Edward didn't know he needed, the closing of a cycle of guilt and the true beginning of his family's new journey, now united not by tragedy, but by forgiveness. The months that followed transformed the silent mansion into a true home. Music played in the hallways again, and Leo's laughter became the house's soundtrack. Edward, Leo, and Olivia formed a new, unlikely family, bound not by convention, but by a shared journey of pain and healing. Edward learned to leave the office earlier, trading financial reports for jigsaw puzzles on the living room floor. Olivia, with her serene presence, became the center of gravity of this new universe, and the professional respect between her and Edward blossomed into a quiet, deep affection. They were living proof that a family is not defined by blood, but by the choice to stay together in the darkest of times. Edward's transformation was complete. He remained a successful businessman, but the definition of wealth had changed for him. The real profit was no longer in the stock market charts, but in the sparkle in his son's eyes. He channeled his fortune and his energy into the foundation that Olivia now directed, which quickly became a benchmark in humanized care, helping hundreds of families who felt lost, just as he once had. He learned the most valuable lesson of his life, that the purpose of his immense wealth was not to build walls to protect himself from pain, but to build bridges to connect with the humanity of others. Leo, in turn, flourished. Although his physical recovery was a long and arduous path, his soul, once captive, was free. He talked again, asked questions, dreamed. The boy who used to spend his days staring at nothing now pointed at the clouds, making up stories about their shapes. His journey from silence to voice, from paralysis to presence, was a daily testament to the power of love and patience. He was no longer the living memory of a tragedy, but the vibrant symbol of a resurrection. A boy who, in being found, helped his own father find himself in the process, healing 2 generations at once. In the end, Edward understood that what had been broken in his life could not be fixed with money. He had all the resources in the world, but he lacked the essential. The cure for his son and for himself came not from a sophisticated machine or a renowned specialist, but from the courage of a young woman who dared to offer the only thing that truly mattered: her unconditional presence. She didn't bring a therapy, she brought herself, and that was enough. For he discovered that a home is not built with marble and glass, but with laughter and affection, and that the deepest silence is not broken by protocols, but by the soft sound of a heart that simply decides to stay. A story that reminds us of the power of simple human presence. If your heart was touched by the journey of Edward, Leo, and Olivia, subscribe, like, and comment where you're watching from. Let's spread the message that sometimes the greatest cure is just being there.